Let me start with something that sounds simple, but psychologically, it can change the entire way you approach relationships. Stop trying to convince someone to choose you. Because the moment you find yourself thinking, what can I say? What can I do? How can I make them understand how much I care? You have already entered a dangerous emotional position. You are no longer simply expressing love. You are attempting to negotiate for acceptance. And those are two completely different things. You can communicate your feelings. You can explain your intentions. You can show someone that you are committed, loyal, patient, and emotionally available. But there comes a point where explanation becomes persuasion. Persuasion becomes chasing, and chasing slowly becomes self-abandonment. This is particularly important when you're dealing with avoidant patterns. When someone becomes distant, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable, your nervous system may interpret that distance as a problem that needs to be solved. You start analyzing every message. You replay conversations. You wonder whether you came on too strong, whether you should have been more patient, whether you should have given them more space. And suddenly, instead of asking, is this relationship meeting my needs? You are asking, what do I need to become so this person will finally choose me? That's the trap. Because your value is never supposed to be determined by your ability to overcome somebody else's resistance. Think about that for a moment. If someone needs to be repeatedly convinced that you're worth choosing, what exactly are you trying to win? Love that has to be argued into existence is not the same thing as love that is freely given. And this doesn't mean an avoidant person doesn't have genuine feelings. That's where emotional maturity matters. Someone can care about you and still struggle with intimacy. Someone can miss you and still withdraw. Someone can have feelings and still lack the capacity, readiness, or willingness to build the relationship you want. But here's the distinction you must understand. Feelings are not the same as decisions. Someone's internal conflict is not your responsibility to resolve. You cannot love someone into emotional readiness. You cannot communicate someone out of their defenses. You cannot perform perfectly enough to eliminate another person's fear of intimacy. And you certainly cannot sacrifice your dignity until they finally say, okay, now you're worthy. No, your responsibility is not to convince them. Your responsibility is to observe. Observe what they do. Observe what they consistently offer. Observe whether their actions match their words. Observe whether the relationship has reciprocity, because mature love isn't built on potential. It's built on participation. And this is where your power begins to return. Instead of asking, how do I make them choose me? Ask, are they choosing me through their behavior? That's a completely different question. It moves you from desperation into discernment. It moves you from emotional reaction into conscious decision-making. And perhaps most importantly, it forces you to recognize something uncomfortable. Sometimes the person you're desperately trying to convince is not actually rejecting your value. They are simply not capable of giving you what you need. Those are not the same thing. Their inability to choose you does not prove that you are unlovable. Their hesitation does not prove that you are inadequate. Their avoidance does not mean you need to work harder. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop presenting evidence for your own worth and allow another person to reveal what they're willing to do with the opportunity to love you. Because when you stop trying to convince someone, you create space for truth. If they want to come closer, they can come closer. If they want to communicate, they can communicate. If they want to build something real, they can participate in building it. And if they don't, you finally have an answer that no amount of chasing could have produced. That is not rejection of your identity. That is information about compatibility, readiness, and choice. And once you understand that, you stop begging for a place in someone's life and start becoming deeply committed to your place in your own. Never negotiate your worth with someone who has already been given the freedom to see it. And once you stop trying to convince someone to choose you, the next psychological shift is learning to understand what their distance is actually telling you. Because when someone pulls away, most people don't interpret the behavior as information. They interpret it as a challenge. They think, I need to fix this. And that reaction is understandable. When we become emotionally attached to someone, uncertainty creates tension. The human mind hates unresolved situations. If someone suddenly becomes distant, your brain begins searching for an explanation. You replay conversations. You analyze their messages. You look for hidden meanings. You ask yourself what changed, and before you realize it, their distance has become the central problem of your life. But here's the question I want you to ask instead. What if their distance isn't a problem for you to solve? What if it's information for you to interpret? That's a powerful psychological distinction. When someone consistently withdraws, communicates inconsistently, avoids emotional conversations, or repeatedly creates distance after moments of closeness, you don't necessarily need to understand every reason behind it before you respond. You need to notice the pattern, because people often become obsessed with understanding why someone behaves a certain way while completely ignoring what that behavior is producing. Maybe they're afraid of intimacy. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they have unresolved emotional defenses. Maybe they genuinely care but struggle with closeness. Maybe they simply don't want the relationship. There can be dozens of explanations. But here's what matters. Regardless of the explanation, the effect on you is real. You're experiencing uncertainty. You're waiting. You're questioning yourself. You're becoming emotionally exhausted. And if you spend all your energy trying to diagnose their psychology, you can completely lose awareness of your own psychology. This is where emotional maturity begins. You don't have to hate an avoidant person to stop pursuing them. You don't have to label them as cruel. You don't have to assume every withdrawal is manipulation. You simply have to become honest enough to say, whatever the reason is, this pattern isn't working for me. That statement changes everything, because now you're not trying to control them. You're evaluating reality. And that's what emotionally powerful people do. They don't build their lives around potential. They respond to patterns. One distant message might mean nothing. One quiet day might mean nothing. But repeated inconsistency is different. When words repeatedly promise connection, while actions repeatedly create distance, believe the pattern. Not because people can never change, but because you cannot build your emotional security around who someone might become. You build it around who they are consistently choosing to be. And this is especially important when you're dealing with an avoidant dynamic, because intermittent closeness can create an incredibly powerful attachment loop. You receive warmth, then distance, connection, then silence, affection, then withdrawal. And that unpredictability can make you want the person even more because your mind becomes focused on recovering the closeness you once experienced. You begin chasing the next moment of connection. But love should not feel like winning a reward after surviving emotional deprivation. You are allowed to step back and observe. You are allowed to say, I don't need to decode every silence. I need to decide what this pattern means for me. That's sovereignty. And once you develop that mindset, their distance loses some of its power. You stop asking, how do I get them back? You start asking, is this the kind of relationship I want to live inside? That's the question that protects your dignity, because their behavior is not always a verdict on your worth. Sometimes it's simply a revelation of their capacity, and your job is not to chase the explanation. Your job is to recognize the information. Stop treating distance like a puzzle to solve. Sometimes distance is the answer. And once you recognize that their distance is information rather than a puzzle you have to solve, the next step is even more important. You have to reclaim your emotional power by ending the chase, because chasing doesn't always look like running after someone. Sometimes chasing looks sophisticated. It looks like constantly checking your phone. It looks like sending the perfectly worded message. It looks like giving them space while secretly waiting for them to come back. It looks like researching attachment styles at 2 in the morning, analyzing their last conversation, watching their social media activity, or trying to determine whether their silence means they're scared or simply losing interest. You may not physically be chasing them, but psychologically, you're still running after them. And that's the part you have to recognize. Your attention is one of the most valuable resources you possess. Wherever your attention goes repeatedly, your emotional energy follows. If your mind is constantly occupied with what another person is doing, feeling, thinking, or deciding, you've handed them psychological control over your internal world. That's why ending the chase is not about playing a game. It's about taking your mind back. You are saying, I refuse to spend every waking hour trying to manage another person's emotional availability. And that is a profound act of self-respect. Now, some people misunderstand this. They think if I stop chasing, they'll miss me. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. But that's not the point. If your reason for stepping back is to manipulate them into pursuing you, you're still emotionally dependent on their reaction. You're still chasing, just from a greater distance. True detachment says something very different. I am stepping back because I refuse to abandon myself in pursuit of someone else. That's freedom. And psychologically, this matters because the chase often creates an imbalance. One person pursues connection while the other controls access to it. The pursuer becomes increasingly focused on closing the distance, while the avoidant becomes increasingly focused on creating more of it. Then both people become trapped in predictable roles. One reaches, the other retreats. One asks for reassurance, the other feels pressured. One becomes more anxious, the other becomes more distant, and the cycle strengthens itself. You don't break that cycle by becoming better at chasing. You break it by refusing to participate in the pattern. That might mean giving someone genuine space without using that space as a secret strategy. It might mean stopping repeated messages. It might mean returning your attention to your work, your friendships, your goals, your physical health, your creativity, and the life that existed before this person became the center of your emotional universe. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop making another person responsible for your emotional stability, you become far more stable. You no longer need immediate reassurance. You no longer need to interpret every silence. You no longer need to force clarity from someone who isn't offering it. You can tolerate uncertainty without allowing uncertainty to destroy your peace. That is emotional strength. And notice what happens when you do this. You begin to see the relationship more clearly. When you're chasing, you're focused on the outcome. When you're observing, you're focused on reality. You start noticing whether they actually initiate, whether they communicate, whether they make plans, whether they follow through, whether they move towards you without being pulled. And now you're not trying to create evidence that they care. You're allowing their behavior to provide the evidence. That's a completely different psychological position, because the goal isn't to become so detached that you don't care. The goal is to care without losing yourself. You can love someone and still have boundaries. You can miss someone and still move forward. You can hope they return and still refuse to wait indefinitely. You can understand their fears without making those fears your responsibility. That's what mature love looks like. So stop chasing the person who keeps creating distance. Turn around, not because you're trying to make them follow you, but because your life is waiting for you to start living it again. When you stop chasing them, you don't lose your power. You finally take it back. And once you've stopped chasing, something very important begins to happen. You create the space for reality to reveal itself. Because as long as you're constantly available, constantly reaching out, constantly repairing the connection, you may never discover what the other person would actually do if you stop carrying the relationship. This is why stepping back can be so powerful. Not because you're trying to punish them, not because you're trying to make them jealous, not because you're hoping they'll panic and come running back. You step back because you need to discover whether there is genuine reciprocity. Think about that. If you are always initiating the conversation, who knows whether they would have initiated it? If you're always making the plans, who knows whether they would have made one? If you're always repairing the distance, who knows whether they would have crossed it themselves? Your constant effort can unintentionally hide the truth. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is stop filling the silence. Let the silence exist. Let them experience what the relationship feels like when you're no longer doing all the emotional labor. This isn't manipulation. It's observation. There is an enormous psychological difference between withdrawing to provoke a reaction and stepping back to observe reality. Manipulation says, I'm going to disappear so you'll miss me. Self-respect says, I'm going to stop overextending myself so I can see what you genuinely choose to do. Those are completely different motivations. And this is where boundaries become so important. A boundary isn't a threat. A boundary isn't, if you don't text me by Friday, I'm done. A boundary is a decision you make about what you will and will not participate in. You might decide, I will not remain in a relationship where communication is consistently one-sided. You might decide, I won't continue offering emotional intimacy when there is no willingness to build mutual commitment. You might decide, I care about this person, but I will not sacrifice my peace to maintain access to them. That's not cruelty, that's clarity. And here's something people often misunderstand about avoidance psychology. Giving someone space doesn't mean abandoning your standards. You can give them room while still observing whether they use that room to move toward you. You can respect their need for independence without accepting indefinite emotional unavailability. You can understand that intimacy may activate their defenses without volunteering to become the person who absorbs the consequences of those defenses forever. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-neglect. Boundaries without compassion can become bitterness. You need both, because ultimately, you are not trying to force someone into choosing you. You're creating the conditions where their choice becomes visible. If they genuinely want connection, they have the opportunity to demonstrate it. If they value you, they can show it. If they're ready to communicate, they can initiate. If they're capable of building something reciprocal, their behavior will eventually reflect that capacity. And if they don't, then you have learned something incredibly valuable. You have learned without begging. You have learned without interrogating. You have learned without sending another 10 messages. You have learned simply by allowing reality to speak. And reality is often much quieter than our anxiety. Anxiety says, do something. Self-respect says, observe. Anxiety says, fix this before they leave. Self-respect says, if this connection requires me to abandon myself, I would rather lose the connection than lose myself. That is the deeper lesson. You cannot control another person's choice, but you can control whether you continue offering yourself to someone who repeatedly refuses to meet you halfway. So stop measuring your value by how hard you can work to keep someone. Let them show you what they are willing to contribute. Let their actions speak. Let their consistency speak. Let their initiative speak. Because when you stop doing all the work, you don't create the truth, you reveal it. And once you've allowed reality to reveal itself, there's another level of strength you have to develop. Choosing yourself without becoming bitter. Because this is where many people get confused. They finally stop chasing the avoidant. But instead of becoming emotionally free, they become emotionally hostile. They say, fine, I don't care anymore. They start playing games. They deliberately delay responses. They post things designed to provoke jealousy. They try to make the other person regret losing them. But here's the problem. If your entire strategy is designed around making someone feel your absence, you're still psychologically organized around that person. You're still asking, what will they think? That's not freedom. That's another form of attachment. Real self-respect is quieter. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need revenge. It doesn't need the avoidant to suffer before you can feel valuable. You simply decide that your emotional well-being is no longer negotiable. And that distinction is critical. You can understand why someone withdraws without accepting unlimited withdrawal. You can have compassion for their fears without making their fears your responsibility. You can recognize that someone may have learned to protect themselves through emotional distance while still saying, I cannot build a healthy relationship inside this pattern. That is emotional maturity, because understanding someone is not the same as excusing them. And compassion is not a contract requiring you to tolerate everything. Think about what happens when you constantly explain away someone's behavior. They're just scared. They had a difficult childhood. They need more time. They're overwhelmed. They don't know how to express feelings. Maybe all of those things are true, but here's the question that matters. What is happening to you while you're waiting for them to change? Because empathy can become dangerous when it causes you to ignore your own reality. You can become so focused on understanding their wounds that you stop acknowledging your wounds. You become the therapist instead of the partner. You become the rescuer instead of the equal. And eventually the relationship becomes a project where your purpose is to heal someone else rather than experience mutual love. That's not what you're here for. You're not here to prove that you can love someone through anything. You're here to build a life and relationship where love doesn't require the destruction of your own identity. And choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop caring. In fact, sometimes choosing yourself is the most honest form of love available. You stop manipulating, you stop demanding, you stop trying to control the outcome. You say, I care about you. I understand that you have your own fears and limitations, but I also have needs, and I'm not going to betray those needs just to keep you close. That's strength. And notice the philosophical depth of that position. You're recognizing the difference between desire and dependency. You can desire someone without needing them to validate you. You can want their love without making their love the foundation of your self-worth. You can be disappointed without becoming destroyed. You can lose a relationship without losing yourself. That's freedom. And when you reach that point, something extraordinary happens. You stop asking, how can I make them choose me? And you start asking, do I choose the relationship they're actually offering? That question puts you back in your own life, because relationships are not auditions where one person sits in judgment while the other desperately tries to qualify. Two people are supposed to be choosing. Two people are supposed to be participating. Two people are supposed to be creating. If only one person is doing the choosing, the relationship has already become unbalanced. So don't become ruthless because you're hurt. Become clear because you've grown. Don't punish them. Don't chase them. Don't try to make them regret you. Simply refuse to abandon yourself. And if they return, don't ask only whether they missed you. Ask whether they have changed their behavior. Because missing you is an emotion. Choosing you is a decision. And decisions are demonstrated through action. Choose yourself so completely that losing someone else never requires you to lose who you are. And when you finally learn to choose yourself without bitterness, you arrive at the deepest lesson of this entire conversation. The ultimate victory is no longer needing someone else's choice to tell you who you are, because that's where real freedom begins. For so long, you may have believed the outcome of the relationship would determine your worth. If they came back, you would feel valuable. If they committed, you would feel chosen. If they finally opened up, you would feel like all your patience had been justified. But think about the psychological trap inside that belief. You're allowing another human being's emotional capacity to become the scoreboard for your identity. And no matter how much they love you, that's too much power to give another person. Someone can reject you and still be wrong for you. Someone can love you and still be unable to build a healthy relationship with you. Someone can miss you and still choose not to return. Someone can recognize your value and still not possess the capacity to give you what you need. None of those realities determine your worth. They determine compatibility. That's a profound distinction. Your worth is intrinsic. Compatibility is relational. Your worth doesn't rise because someone chooses you, and it doesn't collapse because someone doesn't. This is especially important when dealing with avoidant patterns, because you can become addicted to the moment of being chosen. Maybe they finally open up after weeks of distance. Maybe they suddenly become affectionate. Maybe they tell you how much they miss you. And because you've been starving for emotional confirmation, that moment feels enormous. But you have to ask yourself, is this a moment or is this a pattern? Because one emotional conversation does not automatically equal emotional availability. One return does not automatically equal commitment. One expression of love does not automatically equal the ability to sustain love. That's why your standard cannot simply be, do they have feelings for me? Your standard has to become, can they consistently participate in the relationship I want? That's a much more mature question. And when you stop needing their choice, you can finally evaluate their choice clearly. If they choose you, you don't cling desperately. You observe whether their actions support that choice. If they don't choose you, you don't collapse. You grieve, you learn, you move forward. You don't turn rejection into a referendum on your identity. This is what emotional sovereignty looks like. It means you can say, I wanted this relationship. I cared deeply. I hoped it would work. But I will not force reality to become something it isn't. That's courage. Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't leaving someone. The hardest thing is accepting that you cannot make them become the person you hope they would be. You have to release the fantasy of potential and confront the reality of behavior. And that doesn't mean becoming cynical. You don't have to conclude that nobody can be trusted. You don't have to decide that love is pointless. You simply become more discerning. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You stop confusing chemistry with compatibility. You stop confusing someone's fear of losing you with their ability to build a relationship with you. And you stop confusing being wanted occasionally with being chosen consistently. That's the transformation. You no longer need to win. You no longer need to prove. You no longer need to convince. You no longer need to monitor their every move. You become grounded in your own decision. I know what I want. I know what I will accept. I know what I will not accept. And I am willing to walk away from what continually asks me to betray myself. That is not arrogance. That is self-respect. And perhaps the greatest paradox is this: when you no longer need someone to choose you, their choice becomes far less important, but also far more revealing, because now you're capable of seeing it without desperation. If they step forward, you can evaluate. If they step backward, you can release. Either way, you remain standing. So don't make your life's mission to become unforgettable to someone who couldn't choose you. Make your mission to become unforgettable to yourself. Build a life you don't want to escape from. Build relationships where reciprocity is normal. Build standards that protect your peace. Build an identity that doesn't disappear when someone walks away. And then love from that place. Not from fear, not from scarcity, not from begging, from abundance. Because the person who truly wins isn't the one who finally gets the avoidant to chase. The real victory is becoming someone who no longer needs to be chased, chosen, or validated to know their own worth. So let me bring this all together. If there's one thing I want you to take away from everything we've discussed, it's this: never beg someone to choose what they are unwilling to choose freely. You can love deeply without chasing desperately. You can understand someone's avoidant patterns without making excuses for behavior that continually hurts you. You can give someone space without putting your life on pause. And you can care about someone without making their emotional availability the measurement of your worth. Because the moment you stop trying to convince someone to choose you, you begin choosing yourself. You stop treating their distance like a puzzle that you have to solve. You stop analyzing every message, every silence, every change in tone. You stop asking, what can I do to make them stay? And you start asking the question that matters far more. Is this relationship actually giving me what I need? That question changes your entire psychology, because love is not supposed to be an audition. You should not have to constantly prove that you're worthy of someone's attention. You should not have to shrink your needs so someone else can remain comfortable. You should not have to become endlessly patient while receiving almost nothing in return. And you should never have to abandon yourself just to maintain access to another person. Maybe they are afraid. Maybe they have wounds. Maybe intimacy triggers something inside them. Maybe they genuinely care about you but don't know how to handle closeness. Have compassion for that. But remember, understanding someone's struggle does not obligate you to live inside it. Their healing is their responsibility. Your life is yours. And when you finally stop chasing, you create something incredibly powerful: space for truth. If they want you, they have the opportunity to show it. If they value you, they can demonstrate it. If they are ready, they can participate. And if they don't, you don't need to collapse. You don't need revenge. You don't need to make them jealous. You don't need to prove that they made the biggest mistake of their life. You simply accept the information and move forward. Because sometimes the greatest act of self-love isn't getting someone back. Sometimes it's refusing to lose yourself trying to get them back. And that's the deeper lesson here. Your worth is not determined by who chooses you. Your worth existed before they met you. It remains when they leave. It remains when they hesitate. It remains when they cannot give you what you need. You are not less valuable because someone lacks the capacity to recognize, receive, or reciprocate what you offer. So from this moment forward, stop begging for clarity from someone committed to confusion. Stop chasing consistency from someone who repeatedly gives you uncertainty. Stop negotiating your standards because you're afraid of losing someone. And stop confusing someone's occasional attention with genuine commitment. You deserve more than moments. You deserve consistency. You deserve reciprocity. You deserve a relationship where you don't have to constantly wonder where you stand. And if someone chooses to walk away, let them walk. Not because you don't care, but because you finally understand that you cannot force someone to choose you, and you don't need to. The right relationship won't require you to beg for your place in it. So lift your head, take your power back, return your attention to your life, and remember this: never beg someone to choose you. Choose yourself so completely that whoever stays must meet you at the level of your self-respect.